And so as Jasmine said, my name is Brian Jackson. I'm one of the science editors for the Planetary Science Journal. I'm not the only one, and I'll introduce some of the others shortly. But I wanted to start with just basically giving you a sense for what is the Planetary Science Journal. This is a relatively new journal that was just begun 2 years ago, and it's focused on, as you might expect, planetary science. It's an open access journal devoted to recent developments and discoveries, theories in planetary science. And the journal welcomes all aspects of investigation in the solar system and the planetary systems. And it's really important, maybe I want to highlight here that we're still sort of developing the scope for this journal. And so if you have a paper that's sort of planetary science related in some way, we encourage you to submit. And most of the time we end up taking submissions. It's only submissions that are well outside the normal scope of planetary science that we end up declining. So if you have, we've gotten things like descriptions of research meetings, review articles, all kinds of things that we feel like fit into the scope of this journal. So if you have something you think might work, don't hesitate to contact us and ask about it. So how do you submit a paper? Ooh, let me see. That's strange. I don't seem to be. Okay. So submitting a paper is pretty simple. There's instructions on the Planetary Science Journal's website, very detailed instructions for how to submit a paper. Essentially, if you click on that, it brings you to this page, which describes everything from the scope of the journal all the way down to the format of the files that you need to submit for us. Of course, we take all the standard formats for journal articles. One format that might be particularly useful and a process that might be especially helpful for everyone is submitting a paper in LaTeX format. And there's an online resource for creating LaTeX documents called Overleaf that I've personally found extremely helpful. I think a lot of other folks in the field have begun to use this. So if you're looking for a way to do LaTeX, maybe you write your papers in Word, but you'd like to switch over to LaTeX, this is a really good option, Overleaf. And then the actual document that you're editing in Overleaf looks a little like this. This is an example from a paper that I wrote myself. So you've got your source here on the left, and then this is the PDF that's generated automatically by Overleaf. One of the really great things about Overleaf is that you can actually submit directly to the AAS journals from Overleaf. So there's actually a button in the top right-hand corner that allows you to submit directly to the AAS journals from Overleaf. So that's a really nice option. So let's say you submit your paper. You click that submit button. What happens next? Well, our chief editor, Dr. Faith Vilas, assigns a scientific editor to your paper. So one of the scientific editors with Planetary Science Journal will be in charge of shepherding that paper to publication. And here are all of our lovely science editors. Dr. Faith Vilas is on the far left. On Wikipedia, she's listed as also known as ultraviolet. So I'm going to have to ask her what that's all about. I don't know anything about that story. Maybe she can comment on that at some point. We've got Dr. Ed Rivera Valentin, one of our science editors, Dr. Maria Womack. I think both Ed and Maria are in the Zoom with us here. And then, of course, myself, science editors. And so one of us will be assigned. We all have kind of a range of expertise. And so Faith tries to assign an editor who might have some relevant expertise to your article so they can help shepherd it more effectively. But there's also some question of workload. She tries to balance all of that stuff. In any case, once you submit your paper, it's assigned to one of us to shepherd through the process. The science editor will agree to handle the paper. So we actually have some discretion about whether or not we take a paper. Sometimes we'll decline because we're too busy, or maybe there's a conflict of interest, or maybe we just don't feel like we know enough about that topic, and so we'll decline and another editor will be assigned. Once a scientific editor has agreed to accept a paper, to shepherd the paper through the process, we then go to the AAS Journal's website to review the paper ourselves. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain as to what that looks like for an editor. If you've submitted to the AAS Journals before, you've probably seen a page that looks just like this, except that for editors, we have a whole bunch of other options below the author tasks. So this is what it looks like for a scientific editor. I will myself, if I come to take a paper, as the editor, I'll go basically click on this field here, agree to / decline scientific editor assignment. And then I'll see a page that looks a little bit like this here. Of course, I've basically masked out all of the information for this particular paper, but this is all the information we see for a manuscript up front. We also have access, of course, to this document itself, abstract information, all of that. The next step in that process is that we make a list of potential reviewers, and then we send out requests to review the paper. So this is a step in the process that can be quite challenging from the editor's perspective, and I think it's probably not like obvious to authors how involved this step in the process actually can be. It can often take us weeks to find a reviewer. So sometimes I'll get someone will submit a paper, and they're expecting a review back in about 6 weeks after they submit the paper. But the thing is that clock, that 6-week clock, doesn't start ticking until after we find reviewers for your paper, okay? And sometimes finding the reviewers can take weeks. So if you email us 6 weeks after you submitted your paper and you're like, where's my review? Chances are it took us a while to find reviewers for you. And so we're still waiting to get those reports back. And I'm going to come back to this point later, but just realize that once you click submit on a paper, it actually can take quite a couple of weeks to get your paper in the process. There is an opportunity that you have as authors to give us suggestions for reviewers. So suggested reviewers are going to be people who are obviously not directly involved with the paper. They shouldn't be people who you have a close professional or personal relationship with, but they should be people who have some expertise in the field in which your paper appears. If you do not provide suggested reviewers, that will delay your paper. Because if you don't provide a suggested reviewers, then we as editors have to go through. Very often I go through the manuscript and look for citations, references, and then I try to find out about the people who are authors on those references. And that takes a while because I got to do a lot of Googling. Sometimes people don't have websites. Sometimes people don't have curriculum vitae that I can use to assess whether they'd be qualified. So when you submit your paper, do not hesitate to put suggested reviewers here. Do not hesitate to do that. Also, if you have specific reviewers you would like not to be involved, those are the deprecated reviewers, please put those as well. These are folks who might have some kind of a scientific conflict with you. Now, those don't have to be someone that is like your professional enemy or something. These can just be people that you feel would not be able to give an unbiased review for whatever reason. And we take those deprecated reviewers very, very seriously. I have never sent a manuscript to be reviewed by a deprecated reviewer, never, and I wouldn't. Because there's always good reasons why people want to deprecate reviewers. So two things, be sure to give us suggested reviewers and list any deprecated reviewers. We don't read anything into that, I should say. If you deprecate a reviewer, we don't make any judgment calls about that. We don't pass any value judgments on that. I see Kelsey's asking, does that mean you typically ask for reviewers to get the reviews back in 6 weeks? Yes, I believe that's the case, and maybe Ed or Maria want to correct that. 3 weeks. Yeah, okay, sorry. Right, okay, thanks for correcting that. I apologize. Yeah, 3 weeks is the usual time that we ask, but that doesn't mean that's what it takes, and I'll come back to that later. I apologize. Yeah, I literally have it written on the next page, so sorry. But as to that deadline, recall that the world is basically on fire right now, and very often reviews are coming back later than 3 weeks. So we as editors do our best to accommodate those kinds of delays for these review reports. I recognize that for authors that can be problematic, and so we're trying to thread this needle of kind of gently pressuring reviewers to turn the reviews in quickly, but also giving them space to do a good job of it in the midst of what is very often kind of widespread personal, professional distractions. Let's see, I have a question here. What is the line for a suggested reviewer which is not all right to recommend? I believe there's a description of some of that on the website, but suggested reviewers shouldn't be anyone you have close professional contact with. Like your PhD advisor should probably not be a reviewer if you have recently graduated. Now, if you're 5 or 6 years out of your PhD, at that point probably your graduate advisor is a reasonable option. But if you just graduated like last week, sending a paper to your PhD advisor is probably not a great choice. Certainly, it can't be any of the authors on the paper itself. I don't know. Any other thoughts about that, Ed, Maria? Yeah, so financial interest. We actually get automatic warnings in the system when you suggest a reviewer who's at one of the institutions for one of the authors. We'll get a warning that there may be an institutional conflict. So say, for instance, you submit a suggested reviewer and your third author on your paper is at Oxford and the suggested reviewer is also at Oxford. The system will actually give us a warning that this might be an institutional conflict. In that case, usually, at least me personally, I will hesitate to send a paper to someone at the same institution unless it's a really big institution where there's a very good chance that those folks don't even know each other. So really big places, sometimes it's hard to, and if you have papers with 20 or 30 authors on them, there's a chance you're going to have some kind of institutional conflict, a very good chance there. And so then I look at to see what institution it is. And if it's an institution with like 3 people at it, then I would probably not send a request to one of the reviewers at that institution. If it's an institution that has 200 or 300 people, then I sort of feel like the institutional conflicts is not as big a deal. But there's some judgment call there. So with regard to this delay in the return of reviews, again, editors are trying to be very understanding about these personal issues. However, if you are a reviewer and you need more than 3 weeks to complete your review, that is not a problem. That is not a crisis. Please contact your editor to let them know. It's very typical to give a week or 2 extension on these reviews. The absolute worst thing you could do as a reviewer is to just stop responding to email requests for updates. And I've had that happen a handful of times where someone will agree to review a paper, 3-4 weeks later, I'm still waiting for the review. I'm emailing them, a week or 2 goes by and they don't respond at all. That is a real problem because then we have to go back and find another reviewer, and that basically resets the clock and significantly delays the paper. It's better for us to give you an extension than it is for us to just not hear from you. So if you need an extension, don't feel guilty. It's not a judgment on your value as a scientist. Just let us know and we will do what we can to accommodate you. I'm trying to look at the questions here. Okay, great. I'm glad to answer that question. Okay. Yeah, please don't ghost us if you're a reviewer. Okay. So we've given the reviewers the manuscript, and then hopefully after 3 weeks, usually a little longer, the reviewers will return the report, and then the scientific editor will check over the report. I try very hard as an editor to not simply click forward and send the report on to the authors. I try very hard to check over the reports, make sure that it's all helpful, thoughtful feedback, nothing antagonistic, things that are basically useful feedback to the authors. I will, and the editors are empowered. The editors are empowered to edit the reports that the reviewers turn in. This may not be general knowledge, but the reviewers, your reports can be edited by the editors, and we will edit them. If you send in a report that has obnoxious or sort of overly antagonistic language, I will cut that out. I will leave in the parts that I think are helpful, but I will not allow you to submit reviews that are hurtful or disrespectful to the authors. Most of the time, that's not a problem. The vast majority of the time, people turn in useful, diplomatic, thoughtful feedback. Let me just give you a quick couple of examples of the kinds of feedback that we're looking for on these review reports, and then the things that we're not looking for. Okay. So here, for example, is an example. This is a good comment that we might see in a report. The authors consider process X, whatever that is, but previous studies, and here are some examples, have suggested that process X is not the dominant mechanisms. The authors should explain why they consider process X to dominate. Okay, so that's useful feedback because it says, here's a specific technical concern I have about this study. Here are example references for why I think this particular issue is an issue. And then here's a specific thing the authors can do to address my concern. They should explain why they consider process X to dominate. That's also helpful for me as an editor, because then I can see these references, and sometimes I'll go and look at the references to verify that this is an important consideration. Let me show you a version of this comment which is not useful. The authors consider process X, but it is widely known that process X is not the dominant mechanism. Well, that unfortunately is not a helpful comment, because it doesn't say what's wrong exactly. It doesn't tell the authors what to do to address the concern, and it doesn't provide me, the editor, any information about why that's true. I don't have any reference. I don't have any way of confirming or verifying this. And if the authors come back and say the reviewer's just wrong here, now I'm stuck in a position where I'm trying to judge whether something is true or not in something that may not be a field that I'm an expert in. Okay, so here's what we want to see: we want to see what's wrong, why do you think it's wrong, and what can the authors do to address it. Okay, one more example I'll give you. Here's a good comment. X reference argued that the precise chemical composition of something is not evidence that it is made by life. The author should address this result. And so now we're saying, the reviewer is saying, here's this reference, which is important, that contradicts something the authors are saying. The author should explain why they disagree with this reference, okay? Again, it's what's wrong, what specifically is wrong, and what the authors can do to address the concern. Here's a bad version of that comment. It is embarrassing to have to point out that not knowing the precise chemical composition of something is not evidence that it is made by life. Okay, why is that not useful? Because it's antagonistic. It doesn't say exactly what's wrong, and it doesn't give the authors any way to address the concern. Okay, so things to think about as you write a review. Would you be happy to receive the review that you're writing? Okay, if you got a review that said it is embarrassing to have to point out, you as an author might be offended by that, so please don't write that in a review for somebody else. Are your comments constructive? Do you give the author something to do to address your concern? And then consider whether the authors really made a mistake, or whether they're just saying something in a way that's confusing, whether it's some sort of communication issue. You're always, of course, welcome as a reviewer to say, I think the reviewers meant this. This might not be right. They should clarify, that kind of thing. That's perfectly helpful. And then, like I said, we check over your report as editors, so please be helpful, be polite. We will make note and excise unhelpful or unnecessarily antagonistic language from your report. And then we get your report, we reviewed it, we'll edit it if necessary, and then we forward it to the authors, and there's a 6-month deadline for the authors to revise their manuscript in response to the report. That 6-month deadline is also not a hard deadline. If you need an extension on that deadline, it's not a problem. Just contact the editors. The deadlines really are there to just keep things moving, to make sure that we're all staying in touch with one another, not meant to punish or crack a whip or anything. And so then this part of the process essentially iterates until the editor judges that the publication, the manuscript should be published or should be just rejected. For me, at least, and Ed and Maria could speak to this as well, I pretty rarely have more than 2 rounds of review. Sometimes we only have 1 round of review. So this process doesn't usually iterate too many times. I don't think I've had multiple rounds of review where we end up just rejecting at the end. That doesn't happen. Maybe that's happened once for me, but it doesn't happen too often. Usually if we're iterating on a paper, that's a good sign. Usually that's a good sign. I want to highlight here again, though, it's the editor who makes this final judgment call. We are empowered to decide whether to publish or to reject. So if you are a reviewer, recognize that you're making a recommendation, and we take those recommendations very seriously. But don't feel bad if you're saying, oh, I think this would be rejected because this manuscript has these important flaws. You're not the one who has to make that call. You're welcome to make that recommendation, but don't worry about making the recommendation, because it's not the final call. Once you receive a review as an author, one of the best things you can do is maybe take a second, take a little bit of a breather. Sometimes these reviews, even when they're really helpful and constructive, can be a little hard to see, because it's always got something maybe that you didn't consider. So take a breath, walk away, take a day or two to kind of think through what's going on there. In principle, at least, these reviews are meant to be constructive, and usually they are. Consider whether the review is indicating that you need to improve the communication and not necessarily the science. Sometimes you just say something which is correct, but maybe it's not communicated very clearly. And the reports are meant to improve your manuscript. They're not meant to, at least not in principle, not meant to just knock your manuscript. Okay, for some reason my presenter screen is very slow. So then finally, after we've iterated once or twice with the reviewers, the paper will probably be accepted, occasionally rejected, but not that often. And then you're going to be sent article proofs. And that stage of the process at the end is handled by our really excellent editorial staff. The science editors are not usually directly involved in that unless you need to make changes to figures or things at that stage. Usually we've finished our job at that point. Let me just discuss briefly one unique aspect of Planetary Science Journal, and that is the double anonymous review. All of the AAS journals have this as an option, but the Planetary Science Journal has this as the default. So if you submit an article to Planetary Science Journal and you don't explicitly opt out of the double anonymous review, you will be participating in a double anonymous review. And what that means is that not only will the authors not know who the reviewers are, the reviewers will also not know who the authors are. That's what it means by double anonymous. And so all that author name and affiliation information, all the acknowledgments, anything that can identify the author is redacted from the manuscript file. So for example, here's an example of my own manuscript file, and you can see where the author information usually appears in that PDF. That's all been cut out. So the reviewers don't know who the author is. Now, oftentimes the reviewers can infer who the author is based on the way the paper is written, what the topic is, what the references are. But I think a lot of people would be surprised that when you try to guess who the authors are or who your reviewers are, you're not right all that much. So it doesn't pay to try to guess who the authors are or try to guess who your reviewers are, because you're not going to be right that much. The key here is to focus on the science. Is the science in the paper sound? Are there ways to improve the manuscript? Don't worry about who the authors are. Don't worry about who your reviewers are. There's a significant literature that points to the benefits of double anonymous review. I won't go into it because I'm really not an expert myself, but this is a study from a few years ago that basically showed that by implementing a double anonymous review process, we can help to address some of these biases, these gender biases specifically in the field. So we at Planetary Science Journal encourage authors, encourage reviewers to participate in these double anonymous reviews. We think it's beneficial and helps to broaden access to the publication process. And with that, let me just give a quick summary. Planetary Science Journal's publishing process. You submit your paper. An editor finds reviewers. The reviewers return reports. You get published. Things you can do to help this process along. Give us suggested and redacted reviewers. Really give us suggested and redacted reviewers. It significantly lengthens the review process if we don't have suggested reviewers to start with. Stay in touch with your editors the whole way through, whether you're the author or a reviewer. We try to be very nice and accommodating, so don't hesitate to let us know if there's a delay in the process somewhere. If you're a reviewer, keep in mind that you're trying to say helpful things. You're trying to make the paper better. Your goal should not be to tear the authors down. If you're an author, please take what the reviewers say to heart as best you can. Make constructive use of them. If you feel like you get a review which is just overly negative and inappropriate, don't hesitate to let the editors know, and we will do what we can to address that. We will not saddle you with an overly negative report and force you to address those things if we can help it. And with that, I want to say thank you and take any questions we have in the last few minutes.